So when thinking about which lenses to bring with me on a trip, there's one lens in particular, more so than any other lens that I own, that typically causes me to think just a little bit harder than the others. This one lens isn't the most versatile, it isn't the lightest, it isn't the smallest, but for what it does it goddamn well. And as you might have guessed it from the title of this video, of course, yes, that is the 85mm lens. This particular 85mm is the Sony G Master version, which is an f1.4, and it's my favorite 85mm. But everything that I'm talking about in this video refers to any fast prime 85 lens from any manufacturer. Now, the 85mm is not something that most people would use or consider at the very start of their photography journey, and it certainly wasn't for me anyway. When beginners are first choosing, their first couple of lenses, options like the holy trinity of lenses, right? The 1635, the 2470, and the 7200 are usually the first picks. And then maybe followed by like the 35mm or the 50mm or something like that. Oh, and by the way, I'm referring to full frame sizes here when I refer to the 85. So for you APS-C folk, that's a 57-ish millimeter equivalent, so something around there. Now, rarely do beginners pick a 85mm unless that person knows that they're going to be doing portraits. And typically, 85s are traditionally thought of as portrait lenses, which we will get more into in just a moment. Now, tradition isn't wrong, of course. The 85 is a fantastic focal length for portraits, but it's also great at so much more. And I wanted to share all of the reasons why I think it's a fantastic focal length that should be at the very tippity top of your lens choices, and why I recommend it to just about everyone nowadays. All right, now I'm going to split this video up into the usage of the 85mm in terms of its focal length and build, and then how I use the 85 across a broad spectrum of photography, and how you could potentially do the same with your photography too. So first and foremost, the overarching reason, the foundation, the main theme around the entire reason why I love the 85 so much is because it's such a fantastic combination of compression and shallow depth of field when shooting in apertures such as f1.2 or f1.4 or 1.8. Now, for you beginners out there, the term compression refers to a phenomenon where the longer the focal length you start to use, such as like 100 or 150 or 200mm, the more and more the elements in your background seem closer to you in the composition. Now, this is because the longer the focal length that you use, the narrower the field of view becomes at the same time. And it's this narrowing in of the field of view, or this zooming in, that makes it look like certain objects are closer than what they might appear if the same shot was shot at a wider focal length, for example. And you get to see this phenomenon a lot more obviously at focal lengths, above 150, 200, that kind of range. Typically, our human eyes have a standard compression, I guess, at around 50mm or so, meaning that the 85mm focal length has just a teeny bit of compression to the image depending on what you're shooting, right? So backgrounds are drawn just a little bit closer, and that makes it look just that little bit different than if you were to go out and see that scene normally with the naked human eye. Now, in addition to all of this, when you are using a fast prime 85 like a 1.4, the shallow depth of field that you can achieve, especially up close, can be absolutely buttery creamy. And for all of you bokeh whores out there, I know that all of y'all already own one of these lenses. There's just something about the combination of the compression and the shallow depth of field that a 85 fast prime gives you. It's just a certain look that you can't really get using 85mm on a 7200 zoom, for example. Sure, you might get a similar amount of compression using a zoom, but using a fast 85 prime gives the combination of compression and a shallow depth of field that, well, I just think it's a special look. And I know a lot of you out there feel the same way as well. When it comes to the build of the 85s in general, I'm not saying that this is absolutely true of every single 85 out there, but for most 85s, they're typically one of the sharpest, if not the sharpest lenses in the entire range from that particular lens manufacturer. And you only need to take a quick look at DxOMark to see that, out of the top 10 lenses that they've ranked, 6 of those top 10 lenses are all 85mm lenses. Now, I'm no lens designer, so I don't exactly know what's going on here, but for some reason, the 85mm focal length is something that lens manufacturers are able to get super duper sharp. And for any camera manufacturer, whether that's Sony or Sigma or Nikon or Canon, their 85s are typically the very sharpest of the entire range. In addition, when it comes to the size of an 85 prime, like the physical size, they're a fantastic choice here as well. Most of the time, 85s are smaller, lighter, and more compact than if you were to pick up a different lens from the mid telephoto category. Definitely smaller than a 7200 or a 135, for example. And I guess this is like the age-old debate of zooms versus primes that I guess it gives me so much grief when I'm thinking about what to pack when I'm traveling, especially when I'm trying to pack light on a travel trip or something like that. Sure, I could bring a 7200 and, shoot at f2.8 and have all of the wonderful versatility of everything in between those two focal lengths. But it's heavy, it's huge, and it takes up a lot of space in my bag. And, especially when I'm shooting stuff like street photography, it is not very discreet. Whereas if I bring the 85 with me, it's small, it's compact, it's sharp as hell. It produces some wonderfully unique images with that shallow depth of field, but it's also definitely not as versatile as the 7200, and it definitely can't produce as much compression as, say, a 200mm focal length will. But I find that, even with those flaws, I find that maybe 70% of the time, I'm picking the 85 over the 7200. And that's because I use it for so many different categories of photography that I love to shoot, and I love the look that it gives me in all of those categories. So let's get into that. Now, the 85mm focal length is typically thought of as a portrait lens because the slight compression narrows down the frame and it slims down the face, and it gives the portrait subject a more flattering look. The 85mm lens can quite literally make you look like you've lost a kilo or two simply just by changing lenses. And you also get that really shallow depth of field with fast 85s like 1.4 as well. And this gives great subject separation and isolation, especially around the eyes, where sometimes, depending on how close you shoot to the subject, you can have like the eye in focus, but have the eyelash out of focus, drawing the viewer's attention to those eyes, which is a critical component of good portrait photography. And when shooting a little further out and moving just a little bit further back to a more medium composition, a little bit more of a contextual type of portrait, the bokeh that you can get with this lens just gives such an amazing sense of separation between the subject you're shooting and the other elements in the composition, like this example here with the autumn leaves in the midground and the background. It's this subject isolation that, in my opinion, is really where the fast 85mm prime really shines, and it's something that can't be replicated by a 85mm equivalent shot at f2.8 on a zoom lens, for example. But the isolation doesn't have to be used just in a portrait setting or only with portraiture in mind. My other favorite use of the 85mm focal length is with street photography. And I find that using a 85mm focal length for street photography means that you don't need to get up in people's faces like you do with a 35mm or a 24mm, for example. It's a great distance where you can shoot things at a medium range, but using that 1.4 or 1.8, you can also get fantastic subject isolation with a shallowish depth of field at the same time as well. And that makes for some very interesting isolated street compositions, which is especially important in street photography because so often in street, we have so many different elements competing for our attention within our composition. And having and using bokeh and a shallow depth of field allows us to dial in that attention and bokeh out everything else that isn't important in the frame, leaving the things that are supposed to be important tack sharp. Now, I first started doing street photography up close and personal with a 35mm lens, and it's a skill that I recommend everyone at some point in their careers do as well, because it is very, very, very hard, and it's very, very, very confronting. It is a great challenge as a photographer. But ever since moving to 85mm for street, some 4 or 5 years ago, I haven't looked back, because I'm in love with the creamy bokeh and the subject isolation that you get from using this lens. Now, this is completely unorthodox, but I find myself using the 85 for landscape as well, purely because it's in my bag and because that's what I've decided to choose over the 7200 for some trips. And don't sleep on this, because the 85mm focal range is also something that you can make work for landscapes as well. Once you start getting used to the 85mm focal range and start seeing that range in real life, the portability of having a prime in your bag comes in really handy when you want to take a landscape shot with just a little bit more reach than you might traditionally find yourself wanting. Now, don't get me wrong, if you are on a pure landscape photography trip, I would take the 7200 anytime, every time. But the idea that you absolutely need a specific focal length for a specific category of photography is absolutely the wrong way to think about your lenses, in my opinion. Any lens can do any style of photography. It's just how you use it and the effect that you're trying to achieve that determines which lens would be the best to use for any given situation. And that's the thing. To wrap up, I find myself using the 85mm for so many different scenarios that while traditionally most photographers wouldn't think of it as a very versatile lens, especially being, with such a narrow field of view, for me, it's a lens that I bring with me so often. It's one of my top 3 most used lenses in my kit, and it's irreplaceable for me, and I highly recommend that you check it out, and it might become one lens that's irreplaceable for you too. Alrighty, that's it for this video. I hope you enjoyed this topic. Let me know in the comments below which piece of gear or focal length you'd like me to make a video on next, and maybe I'll give that a go and maybe even turn it into a little bit of a series. Now, if you want to support the channel as well, please make sure to check out patk.com/store to check out my courses, presets, prints, and books. But otherwise, I will see you in the next video. But until then, get out there and make something that matters. Peace.